Sunday we saw that power and strength often come from unexpected sources. They often come from places of weakness and brokenness. And in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul shows us that this isn't a coincidence. He uses 3 different images to show us what really impressive gospel living and ministry looked like. He uses the image of the jar of clay, the cross and the empty tomb, and the finish line. The first of those images is in verse 7. It's the jars of clay. In verse 7, Paul is making a very simple point of where God puts the priceless treasure of the gospel message about Jesus Christ. The jar of clay that Paul is talking about, it's a symbol of something that is dispensable, something that's common or ordinary, something that's fragile, something that's easily chipped. Think polystyrene cup. Something that is precious and valuable is stored in something that is fragile, common, and ordinary. We're all decaying, we're all looking spectacularly unspectacular with time. And yet the light of the gospel and the power of God is deposited in me, in you, in us. But why does God do that? He does that in verse 7, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us. God wants to make that clear. Christ's power, his glory, is manifested most fully in our ordinariness, in our weakness, in our brokenness, in our fragility. And that's the way that God displays his glory to the world. Paul then, he lines up 4 pairs of words to describe what the kind of jar of clay lifestyle, what it looks like. He talks about the fact that we're afflicted in every way, but we're not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. Paul is telling us that this is the lifestyle of the normal Christian life. In this life, we will face all kinds of pain and suffering, all kinds of challenges and problems, all kinds of opposition. But there is a power within us that prevents us from caving in and strengthens us to keep going. But even more than that, the suffering and hardship that we face, it's the vehicle, it's the platform that God uses to display his glory. God shines brightest through us in the context of our cracks and brokenness, through our pain, through our struggles, through our problems, through our discouragements. So we should never be ashamed of our weakness, or we should never be ashamed of our fragility or our brokenness or our lack of ability to cope, or we should never be ashamed of our baggy eyes or our sagging, aging bodies. Our suffering is not an indication of the absence of God, but rather it's a reminder of his presence with us. And it's also a reminder of his power and desire to work in and through us for our good and for his glory. The second image, the image of the cross and empty tomb, is in verses 10 to 12. And that brings together life and death. Paul takes up the dying of Jesus. He denies self. He picks up his cross. He follows Jesus with all the consequences of verses 8 and 9. He's afflicted, he's perplexed, he's persecuted, he's struck down, just as Jesus was. But he also says he's also given over to the death of Jesus for Jesus' sake. We always carry this death of Jesus in our body. Why? So that the life of Jesus may also be displayed. The dynamic of the Christian life is that life comes out of death. This work of God bringing life out of death, it's not only for ourselves, but it's also for the benefit of others. The third image is in verses 13 to 15, and it's the image of the finish line. In quoting Psalm 116, Paul seems to be saying that this description of continuing to proclaim the gospel in the midst of adversity, and even increasing adversity, well, that's consistent with what proclamation has always looked like. But why bother? If it's so tough, it's so hard, why do we keep going? Because he knows that in the end, it will be worth it. Paul calls his many troubles our momentary light affliction. But how can he say that? He can say that because of what he compares it to. Our struggles are momentary compared to eternity. They are light compared to the weight of glory. Therefore, we focus on the finish line. Our affliction is not pointless because it produces something. It produces glory. And the eternal weight of that glory is being impacted by our affliction. Whatever the affliction, it is somehow impacting the weightiness of glory that we will experience in eternity. So your suffering that's far from being pointless, your faithful endurance and perseverance and faith is far from being arbitrary. But rather it's bringing about an eternal weight of glory beyond anything that you can compare. Therefore, we do not lose heart. We may not always think it or see it, but God is working through the gospel for our good and for his glory. Even though we're facing all kinds of challenges and hardships, our inner person is being renewed day by day. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Living for Jesus in our world today, it's not easy. Living for Jesus in our world today will sometimes feel like it's an endless saga of frustration and disruption and opposition and temptation and inconvenience and a lack of appreciation and disappointment. But don't give up. If you just scratch below the surface, you will see God powerfully at work, doing his thing. Christ's power, his glory is being manifested most fully in our ordinariness, in our weakness, in our brokenness, in our fragility. It's bringing life out of death. It's producing glory out of affliction and pain.